kick this off, right?
Kick it off.
So you and I were just kind of sharing a lunch together and talking about this, the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, which is a very popular movement, especially I think among young people right now. And in fact, if you're looking for the #1 searched for thing on YouTube videos under the category of personal finance, it is the FIRE movement. So I think that is particularly relevant for today's conversation. So
yeah, absolutely.
I'll tell you what I know about the FIRE movement, and you can share what you know, and then we can talk about, how we feel about all of these things. So I'm all for financial independence, and I am all for retiring early. So I just have to start by saying those things. But I think there are some aspects of this movement which are somewhat irresponsible in terms of the data that's being presented, the accuracy of the data, and the risk that you are potentially putting yourself into, as well as some of the aspects of it in terms of mindset, right? When you look at the movement itself, not the concept of retiring early, but the FIRE movement in particular. So, one of the things that I've seen as I've read through articles on this particular movement is some of the assumptions. So things like save 70% of your income, live a minimalist lifestyle, right? Don't have any debt whatsoever, and then take those assets. And when you have $1 million or something close to that, retire and live off of 3 or 4% of that portfolio every single year. So where do you want to go with this conversation? Because there are so many places we can take it.
I think the Monte Carlo, to be the dork in the room on that one, is probably the first place I'd go.
Okay, so we have to start, because not everybody knows what a Monte Carlo simulation is. We have to start by explaining that. So you brought it up. That's your job.
Stepped into that bear trap. So a Monte Carlo simulation, if you've ever seen them run the lottery, or if you've ever seen a bingo, pulling bingo balls out, that's basically what a Monte Carlo is. So they put in on a little tiny bingo ball. We'll picture the bingo ball in the lottery, right? They put the market rate of return on a bingo ball, and then they put every year that you could possibly have in the S&P 500 or in a bond market, right? They'll put it on a bingo ball, and they put all of these bingo balls in a giant hopper, turn on the air, all the balls are flipping around, and then they stop it and they pull out 30 years of retirement. So if I'm retiring at 65, that gets me to 95. And so that's one possible sequence of returns of what the market would look like. So you're going to have some good years at the beginning, some bad years at the end, and everywhere in between. And then they put all those balls back in, and they repeat that exercise, and they do that over and over again, like 60,000 times. And what they've done in that sort of bingo ball exercise is they've sort of randomized the market and been able to see, on average or in a sequence, what is the market going to return over that 30, 40, 50-year time frame. Is that close enough to Monte Carlo?
Yeah, I think that's really close. So if you think about it, what you're looking at is a specific time horizon where they are using past market performance, right? And they're randomizing all of that data so that you could be in an environment where everything is up and to the right, everything is down and blowing up, or some environment with lots of volatility or even stability, depending on how it's been randomized. And then essentially you plug in a withdrawal rate to that and say, okay, if I had $1 million and I'm spending $80,000 a year, what is the likelihood that I would have any money left at the end of a 30 or 35-year time period, right? And so most of the time when people run Monte Carlo simulations, they run them just for a set retirement period. But if you think about the FIRE movement and the goal is to retire in your 30s or in your 40s, we're essentially doubling the time period that the money needs to last. So, I think it's really interesting on the internet right now, because if you start looking for what is the safe withdrawal rate in retirement, what you typically are going to find is that people have run these Monte Carlo simulations and said that the answer is somewhere between 3 and 4%. And so I think that what people hear is, oh, that's a safe number that works regardless of the time period. But the analysis for most Monte Carlo simulations are really just for around a 30-year time period. And so if you look at that, even, if you're trying to account for inflation and you're looking at a reasonably conservative portfolio, that's kind of how you end up with those numbers. But if you start looking at the graphs for withdrawal rates, they're sloping in a very clear direction, and it is not a positive direction, which means the longer the period of time you're looking at, the higher the likelihood that you will run out of money. And so I think it's really key here to talk about why that happens. And really to get into the idea of what happens when you have an adverse sequence of returns in the market, right? Because if the market is returning nicely and I'm not really seeing a whole bunch of losses and I'm getting, 9% one year and maybe I get 12% the next year and then I get 7% after that, I feel pretty good about taking fairly aggressive withdrawals. The problem is when you have a year like 2008 and the market's down 30-40%, then your withdrawal is compounding that loss, which is going to cause essentially solvency issues in the portfolio over time, right?
Well, and the challenge is you don't know when it's going to happen.
Right.
You don't know when you're going to have the up. You don't know when you're going to have the down. And we had this conversation a couple weeks ago. The days are all running together. We had this conversation a couple weeks ago about the yield curve and the efficient frontier. So go listen to that one if you haven't seen it. But we talked about it. If you look over a 50 or 60 year time frame, the curve looks one specific way. But if we look at it at one decade versus a different decade versus a different, the winners and the losers in any given decade are very, very different depending on what the decade looked like. Right. So to extend that, if I retired in 1990, the first 10 years of my retirement looked very, very different than if I retired in 2000.
Right.
And it all had to do with what the sequence looked like. The 90s was all the way up. The first time you had a bad year was basically 2001, 2002. If I retired in 2000, I had two really, really horrible corrections in the market, all within a 5 to 10 year period of each other.
Right. So if I think about that, so there's a couple things here. A withdrawal rate of 3 to 4% over, let's say you retire at 40, right? You're looking at a very, very long time, potentially as much as 60 years, maybe even longer, that the money needs to last for you. And I think it's really easy to say, oh, well, life expectancy is not 100. But the reality is that you could easily live to be 100, right? My grandmother lived to be 98. Right now, if you look at the statistics from some of the insurance companies, if you have a married couple who is average health by American standards, there's a 50-50 chance one of them will still be alive at 94 or 95. And so planning for life expectancy is, in my opinion, somewhat irresponsible because a large portion of the population lives beyond that. It's an average. And I think even the idea of safe withdrawal rates can frequently be misleading if you haven't looked at the Monte Carlo simulations, because what you're really looking at, or what most people do, is they take an average market return and say, well, as long as I'm withdrawing less than the average, then I should be just fine. And on the surface, that looks really pretty, but it doesn't account for the years that you take losses, which are compounded by your withdrawal, or the fact that as the market is trying to recover, you're withdrawing that recovery and your portfolio can't get back to your original principal amount in those situations. And you have a couple of those situations and your whole lifestyle is different. And this is where I actually have a hard time, is that if I save up and I'm like, I have $1 million and I'm only spending 3% of that a year, that's not a particularly glorious lifestyle either. Right? Like, I don't know if I want to be retired if it means I can't go out to eat and I can't, do much other than like sit at home in my apartment. I mean, that to me defeats the purpose of having done that in the first place. So it's almost this mindset of minimalism. And I see this kind of emerging more and more, but it seems to be driven by this sense of scarcity, minimize debt, minimize obligation, but I'm also minimizing lifestyle at that point. And I don't think life is meant to be minimized.
Well, and it goes to me to this idea of sustainability. And I'm going to nerd out for just a second on something we talked about and nerd out and come back. So there was something called a Dow study that got produced a long time ago. And it said, hey, the average rate of return in I think it was the Dow is 6, 7, 7.5%, something in that range over a really, really long time period. So the early 1900s to the 2000s. So if you look at the average rate of return through that time frame, it was about 7%. But if you look at the average investor experience, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3%.
Mhm.
And what happened is we don't buy and hold and not touch it. We buy at the top of the market because all our friends around us are getting rich in the market and they want some, I want some of that. And so we buy at the top and then the market peaks over and starts heading the other way and we freak out and we get out, but we don't get back in at the bottom like we should because nobody knows when the bottom is. We get back in when it's about halfway up, right? So fear and greed get in there. So when you talk about this idea of minimize, 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 don't spend any money, save 70% of what you make. I can do that for probably 6 months. I can do that for maybe 7 months if I'm really, really disciplined. But then fear and greed, right? I don't want to eat ramen. Ramen sucks.
What? I love ramen.
Well, like the Manchu little cup from when I was in college, right? Yeah. So like, I don't want to eat ramen every day and my kids need shoes and like all these other things come in.
I want to be able to take a nice vacation and not have to slum it. Like I want to do the nice things. And this is, I think this is where you're maybe going.
It's unsustainable, right?
Yeah, it's very scarcity driven, right? I don't want to have to work. I don't want to be obligated. And I understand that, right? Because there's a lot of pressure in our society that says work, grind, hustle. And at some point you grind real hard and you may burn yourself out. So I understand wanting to be in a position where you don't have those obligations, but it makes a lot more sense to try and find ways to do it that don't require you to live a smaller life, right? To find a way that you can still live a very robust and exciting life, because otherwise, no offense, but what's the point? Like, go experience the things, do the things. And yes, there are a lot of things that you can do in life that are not horrifically expensive. But if you have the ability to take that money and to invest into assets that are producing cash flow, and then to use that cash flow to drive your lifestyle, right? And every time you do choose to work, to be able to find additional assets that are driving additional cash flow, then you don't have to give anything up because you're being smarter about what you're doing, as opposed to just parking your money in a bucket, right? And saying, well, I hope this bucket keeps producing, enough yield over time that I'm going to be all right. Because if I look at the Monte Carlo experience, and I'm just going to kind of talk to one that we were looking at recently, in a portfolio that is a 50-50 blend of stocks and bonds, and running all of that, and assuming that we're going to increase our withdrawal by 3% each year to account for inflation, and assuming that someone is managing the assets, and let's say that they're charging 1.5%, somewhere in that range, a 4% withdrawal rate over 35 years has a 25% failure rate. That's a big number. And if I look at a 3% withdrawal rate, it's probably a 6% failure rate. And so if you think about that as an advisor, if I have 100 clients, as an advisor, if I have 100 clients and 25 of those clients are going to go broke during their lifetime, and I put out an advertisement that says, hey, come work with me. For every 100 people that sign on, 25 of you are going to be broke. Absolutely no one would hire me.
Right.
And
well, it's not a good story.
But even if I said, look, I have 100 clients and 6 of them, 4 to 6 of them are going to go broke during their retirement, I still think people would be like, I don't want to hire her because I don't want to be one of the 4 or 6.
Right.
You know what I mean? And yet when we're running these Monte Carlo simulations to get to the safe withdrawal rate, we are saying that we're okay with a certain percentage of these plans failing. And to me, I would have grave concerns if my kid came to me and said, I've done all of this and I'm going to retire, because if they are truly retired for 20 years and then run out of money, how are you going to get a job after that? Because
you get 20 years of zero experience in the market, right?
Right. Whereas if you're actually building your assets to produce income for you, and you're doing that and constantly looking at growing that, you can get to the place where you have a lot of the same freedoms that you would have with the FIRE movement, but you've done it in a way that is much more sustainable over time because you have assets that are truly producing income and cash flow, as opposed to trying to build your principal balance and then depleting that each year with a withdrawal. So it's not, I don't have any problems with FIRE. I know after this podcast, it probably sounds like I do. I like the idea of people being financially independent as quickly as possible so that they can spend their time doing whatever they want. But I think this idea of I'm just going to park my money in the market and take some withdrawals from it, and I'm going to minimize my life, is frankly depressing. And I think that you could end up in a position that you have all the same freedoms, but with a lot more income if you're just more strategic. And
Keep
that's
the concept, just
today.
be smarter. Right.
So I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add to that, but I definitely think after kind of figuring out that that's one of the highest. So here's the thing. I understand why that is the most searched for thing under personal finance, because who doesn't want financial independence? Who wouldn't want enough cash that they can spend their time doing whatever they want? I think the problem is that movement doesn't actually set you up to do whatever you want. It just sets you up to not work and live a small life.
Yeah, well, and then in closing, I think my last comment with that would be, one of the things we've talked about over the years is this idea of having enough. And I think it's a stupid motive for being, because I don't do anything by just having barely enough.
Right.
I don't want to have, I have a 9-year-old and he's starting to go through school right now, and there's grades. And he's like, what grade should I be shooting for? And I'm like, we're shooting for A's. He goes, yes, but Dad, I just need a 71 to pass. And I'm like, that is not how we operate our lives. No. Right. Like that, we're not looking for just enough. Right. And it's this idea of potential. And like, I'm not, what was it, Lou Holtz? Like, I'm convinced that God didn't put us on this earth to be average. Like, I don't want to go approach my life thinking, how can I be smaller? How can I do less, have less? And at the end of the day, if I have a lot of money and if I have gobs and gobs and gobs of money, but I have a heart for doing good things, well, then I can do more things with all the money. It doesn't mean I have to go live like some sort of hedonistic lifestyle and booze and parties and girls every night, but I can.
I don't think Amy would appreciate that.
No, she wouldn't.
I don't think you would either, for being honest.
Nor would I, right? My conscience would eat me up on that one. But I mean, but I have the ability to go do more. I can impact more. I can have a bigger outsized impact on the world around me. But if I'm small, my impact is small.
Right.
And I don't want that.
I think you've given me a new mantra. Don't be smaller, be smarter.
There you go. It's not buckets, it's flow. Don't be small, be smarter. Right?
Be smarter, right? I love this. All right. If you guys have individual questions about the FIRE movement, feel free to reach out to us. You can find me at The Wealth Woman, either on Instagram or Facebook. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and I'm Economics with Eric on LinkedIn. No, I'm myself on LinkedIn, on Instagram and Facebook as well. So thank you guys. Have a great week.